Alright, so in this position, problem number 72, we are asked if white is winning, if he has a decisive advantage, if black can hold the balance, or if it is in fact black who is better. This looks pretty complicated. First of all, we should of course do our material assessment. So in this position, white has a rook and a bishop and a pawn for the queen. So we have material equality in a certain sense, but of course that doesn't tell the whole story. I'm going to go off of my gut instinct first. I really like white. I mean, there's a certain tendency when one side has sacrificed a queen to be really excited, and I feel that a bit right now. I like the bishop. I like both of the rooks who are on the END files, which came up last problem. I love putting rooks on the END files, and white's knight on e4 is great. It's an interesting position in that both players are dealing with this messed up pawn structure. White has advanced pawn to g4 and probably would like to have that pawn back on g2 or g3 to maybe stop back rank mates, but he's opened up a little bit. And black has perfect kingside castling pawn cover, except all the pawns are moved forward one square, which really makes one think that white should be able to get a rook to the 7th rank somehow, and if he does that, things are tremendous. So basically all I want to do is stick a rook on the 7th rank, and I feel really, really good. I don't know how to do that, but that's what I want to do. Alright, so I like white instinctively. I don't know if it's good. I would say that on a gut level, that white, with the advantage of the move, should be better, but maybe black can just play rook d8, and then maybe he's more than fine. Unfortunately, if black plays rook d8, and then we have rook takes d8, queen takes d8, eventually the queen can come in if we're not careful, and all of these squares with the queen and the knight are just going to be a disaster. So there is definitely a time component here. I want to like white so much, but there's definitely a time component. I want to play rook d7, and I can't because of knight takes d7. I want to play rook to e7, and obviously I can't because of queen takes e7. So I'm kept off of the 7th rank for the moment. I guess there is maybe some sacrifice that'll get me to the 7th rank, but I don't see it. For instance, if I were to try rook takes c6, so that knight takes c6 allows rook d7, I don't see any follow-ups. I'm not, just getting a rook to the 7th rank is not enough to win. It's just what I really want to do. I have here captures on f6, which is obvious. I can play rook takes f6, or I can play knight takes f6. The instinct is to capture with the rook, because when the rook captures on f6, it's also hitting the queen, which is nice. I'm assuming that if white captures on f6 with the rook, maybe I'm wrong, I'm assuming that black would want to try and give up the queen, but that's not possible. I don't know why I'm thinking that, because if black ever gives up the queen, then he's just ending up basically 2 pawns down. Rook takes f6, queen takes f6, knight takes f6, king takes f6, and we're 2 pawns down. Bishop e2, for instance, would hold everything for white. There's no problems. There is an intermezzo here. After rook takes f6, there's the option of knight takes c4 at some point. So after rook takes f6, black could play queen takes f6, knight takes f6, and then there's knight takes c4, and in that line, black is still down 2 pawns. White's knight on f6 is hanging, for the moment. But it seems like we can just remove it with knight e4, and we're going to play like rook d7 check. So even if black does get a pawn back with some sequence like knight takes c4 and then knight takes b2, he's only got one of his pawns back. So after rook takes f6, which is really my first candidate move, nothing else looks quite as good to me. I mean, I think I could probably, definitely rook takes f6. After that, I'm assuming that black is going to want to move the queen, naturally, which suggests to me either queen to b4 or queen to e7. After am I able to win by force? Can I play? No. So after something like queen b4, my question is, can I play rook d7 and then meet knight takes d7 with rook to f7 check, and then play knight to f6 and just give mate with rook h7? And I can't do anything like that I'm seeing right away, because when I play knight to f6, black can play knight on d7, captures f6, so I have to throw in another move there, and I don't think I can get away with an extra tempo. Maybe I can. It's so tempting. I really want to get that rook to d7. Rook takes f6, queen b4, rook d7 check, knight takes, and then rook to f7 check. Black has, after rook f7 check, the option of king g8 or king h8. After king h8, I think I can just take on d7 and after queen takes bishop, I can play knight f6, and there's no good defense to rook h7, and everything is covered. The only check would be queen takes g4, and after queen takes g4, then I have knight takes g4, my knight f6 covers everything, and if queen to g8, I can play knight takes queen, and I'm going to be up 2 pawns in a rook endgame, and I can even win rook takes a7. I can be up 3 pawns in a rook endgame. It's just over. The thing is, funnily enough, I think that black can meet my rook f7 with king g8, because I'm temporarily unable to play knight f6 check because of knight takes f6. And if I play rook takes d7 check, then black has queen takes c4. And now when I play knight f6, he doesn't have to step into the corner with king h8. He can play king f8. And maybe it's just a draw, which I don't feel like I really want. Let me show you the whole line that I'm seeing here. I have rook takes f6. There's queen b4, hitting the bishop. We have the move rook to d7 check, knight takes d7, rook f7 check, king g8, double check my continuations, rook takes d7, queen takes c4, knight f6 check, and there's a very famous perpetual that happens here where we go after king f8, knight h7 check, and then the king can go to e8 or g8, and we play knight f6 check, and then the king goes back to f8, and we play knight h7 check, and he moves again, and we just keep coming back between h7 and f6. Shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. And it's just a draw. I want more than a draw, so let's search for other continuations. I don't see any good deviations for black in these lines. I think after rook takes f6, queen b4, rook d7 check, we have at least a draw for white. I want more than a draw. So after rook takes f6, which definitely feels like my favorite move, my prime candidate move, queen b4. Do I have an improvement? I don't see it right away. I don't really want to put the bishop on d3. It just blocks my rook. That feels very bad. And that allows things like knight takes d3 and if I retreat the bishop to b3, his queen on b4 can grab my knight. Rook takes f6, queen b4. I don't see an improvement to rook d7 check with a draw. I don't see an improvement there. Rook takes f6, queen b4. Too much white material is hanging. I want it. What about, so I think rook takes f6, queen b4, I think is a draw. I don't think there's better for white in that line, unfortunately. Very frustrated by that. What about rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook d7 check, king h8, rook f7, queen anywhere in the world, knight f6, and then rook h7 mate. I think this wins. Rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook d7 check, then king h8, rook f7, and the rook on f7 supports knight f6, which supports rook h7 mate. I think that the only option for black is going to be to give up the queen for the rook, and then white has two pieces for the queen, two pieces for the rook, and he's got extra pawns. But what if he does do that at the right time? So rook f7, what if black plays queen to e8 in response to that continuation? And after queen e8, when we do knight f6, black plays queen takes rook, bishop takes, and then black plays rook f8, and the bishop is on f7, and the knight is on f6, and we're gonna drop one of them. Rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook d7 check, king h8, rook f7, queen to e8, knight to f6, queen takes, rook, bishop takes, rook f8. It looks like a refutation. Are there any improvements? Any improvements? Queen e8 is the only move after rook f7, so I'm wondering if there's a quiet move. A move like g5. Maybe? Maybe we have the quiet move g5 there? This seems crazy to me. But after g5, we are threatening knight f6. Because if we play knight f6 in this position, our knight will ultimately be defended on g5 by the pawn. So this continuation where the queen sacrifices off for the rook and black plays rook f8 is out the window. So after g5, we're threatening knight f6. If pawn takes g5, which seems to be the key move. Best try. I was thinking that we could play knight takes g5, and in that position we're threatening rook h8 mate, rook h7 mate, supported by the knight on g5. It looks tempting to me. But in that position, if black plays queen g8 after the knight's on g5, I am stymied again. Stymied? Stymied? Annoyed? Looks so good. We could play a move like b3, a slow move, so we defend the bishop and we're threatening rook moves. There are many tempting rook moves. Does that do it? b3, something like rook d8, and then you play rook takes a7, and there's nowhere for the queen to go. I mean, you're going to have to allow rook h7 mate. This can't... I gotta be too fanciful here. This has got to be too fanciful. This is going to be like my longest video yet. Alright, so rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook f7 check, king h8, rook f7, forces queen e8, getting ready to sack the queen for the rook. Pawn to g5, threatening knight f6. Pawn takes g5, knight takes g5, threatening rook h7, mate. Queen to g8, only move to defend the mate, and then simply b3 to defend the bishop so that white can move his rook anywhere on the board, threaten the queen, force the queen to move, and then play rook h7. And ultimately, black can play rook to d8, and he can block on d5. And I don't see a solution there. Rook to d8. Rook takes a7. Rook to d5. Rook to d5. Just... really? Really, really, really? I don't see what's next. Rook to d5. Black is also threatening rook takes knight on g5 with check. After bishop takes d5, black is going to play queen takes d5. And everything is holding together. After knight f7 check, we can force the king to step into a discovered check. But I don't see that we have a tremendous discovered check. Do we? Maybe we do? The knight goes to f7, the king goes to g7. The king cannot go to f6 because of, at minimum, rook f7 check. So, after we discover from somewhere. So the king's going to have to go to h6. Or back to h7. Or back to h8. I want to play knight f7 check, and then king up. Knight takes e5 check. And then king h8. And after king h8, I want to play bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, knight takes g6 check, king to g8, knight e7 check, forking the queen and the king, and I win the game. And if king h6, then I would want to play knight to g4 check, forcing the king up. But honestly, as I'm looking at it, I don't see that things are so bad for black, even though I can force him up after king to g5. Alright, I'm pulling the plug. I can't quite find a win here. I feel really, really close after rook takes e5. I will not be at all surprised if the computer tells me that I can win after rook takes e5, but I don't see it. I would play rook takes f6, and if black plays correctly after queen b4, I think it's a draw with that perpetual I've seen before. I gotta play rook takes f6. At some point, you just are running out of time. You gotta make a move. Rook takes f6, I don't think loses. I think it's at least a draw for white, possibly more if black overplays his hand. After rook takes e5, I feel really close to a win, but I can't find it, and I might lose if I get the material and then I can't get through. It's important that we did see the queen takes f7 and rook f8 idea, because I was really close to thinking that one. Well, so close. I saw almost everything in the position, but couldn't quite wrap it up. So rook takes e5, which I felt was really close, is the right move, but I didn't go for it. I saw the key lines afterwards. I still didn't go for it. Before we look at rook takes e5, let's look at rook takes f6, which was really my other candidate move. There are other moves like knight takes f6 in the position. This is important. In this position, queen b4 is possible, and the computer evaluates as equal. I don't know if it's thinking the same things that I was, but after rook d8, surprise move, black is better, so good thing we didn't pick this line. But even if black doesn't do this, there are other ways to hold on. So if queen b4, am I right that this is a draw? Not at all, not even close to right. Knight takes rook check. King h8. King g8 is a draw. But I thought that I could play rook takes d7 here. Queen takes bishop is really, really bad. But of course, when you're sacrificing this much material, you got to think about all things, and queen e1 check is just a direct refutation. Alright, but we rejected this line for other reasons. So, rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook d7 check, king h8, right? And interesting, the computer says knight d6 is the best move, which is not given in the books. Rook f7, queen g8. Okay, I didn't pick queen g8. I thought queen g8 just looked questionable, lining up the queen with the bishop, but queen g8, the computer says, is good enough for a draw. There's still the idea after queen g8 of knight f6, queen takes rook. both I and the author thought that the queen e8 move made more sense, and g5 is good enough to win in this line. I really wanted to play this. Good thing we caught the queen takes f7, bishop takes f7, uh, rook f8 problem after knight f6. That is absolutely spot on. H takes g5, knight takes g5, queen g8 is the best line. That's what I was worried about because I didn't see a follow-up. b3, rook d8, and then rook takes a7, and rook d5. We were all up in this line, and I had to pull the plug. King g7, and knight takes e5 check was one move I'm looking at. Also bishop takes d5 it thinks is good. King f6, king h6, knight f7 check, and eventually you take on d5, and you're just better after you pick up the rook, because knight and rook and the pawns are stronger than the queen. King f6 here, knight g4 check, king g5. I saw a variation where we got this position, and bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, knight e3. We're just better with the rook and knight because we've picked up so many pawns. Everything's held together. Pawn takes d5, knight e3 is not as good because the pawn will chase his way, but it's still much better. I just wasn't calculating at the end of that. I thought I needed more than just cashing in, but I don't. Cashing in is good enough. So that's the key. Let's see what the computer says, because computers are smart. So after g5, strong move, really happy to see that move. After g5, if pawn takes g5, knight takes g5, or not there, sorry. After rook f7, queen g8, what's the improvement for black? He's just a tempo up, I guess. So now, after g5, there's rook f8. So sliding the queen over makes way for the rook to come over, and everything holds together. Whoops. So that holds. Whoop. Sorry, I accidentally picked up a different variation. The other line in here that's really important is after king h8, we also had the option of knight d6, which I didn't really consider. I got lost in this other variation, which the author thought was a win, and does not seem to be a win, with the queen g8 instead of queen e8 against rook f7. After knight d6, we just threaten knight f7, and lots of great discovered checks, and it looks like we're just good there. Black is basically in a bit of Zugzwang. So let's see the computer's best line. g5. Computers are weird, man. h4. Pawn takes h4. Knight check. King g7 certainly makes a lot of sense. And then knight takes e5 check. And rook f7 against king f6. We saw a line like that. Actually, f4 is stronger, but multiple good choices. And if the king goes back, we have knight g6. So that's the key. So knight d6 is a win. The instincts are good. The calculation not so good, but that's why we do these, right? Calculation is hard. Chess is hard and calculation is harder. Anyway, that's a really, really nice and challenging problem, and we saw a lot of it in the variations, just not enough of it. And honestly, the grandmasters looking at this game 30 years ago without computers didn't see it all either, because it's really hard. But it's a nice problem position.